Hey, what's up everybody? I'd like to welcome you to another JUCE tutorial. And in this tutorial, what we're going to do is create a very simple sampler. So this sampler is kind of like the hello world of samplers. It's only going to be able to load a file, and you're going to be able to play the file back at different speeds. So I have our finished product here. I can just hit the load button. What this does is this loads up a browser where I can pick an audio file. So I'll just pick this one here. And then when I hit MIDI keys on my keyboard, it will play back the sample at a different rate, different speeds. Yeah, so pretty simple, but pretty effective. So this will get you started if you're ever looking to create your own sampler. And let's go ahead and get going. So I will close out of all this, close out of my previous code and out of this, and we will start a fresh file. So here we go. And today we're going to create a audio plugin. We'll call this Hello Sampler, and I will hit create. And as you can see, it creates our 4 plugin files here from our template here. And I'm going to hit save and open in IDE just to get this open in Xcode. So now I'm just going to close all this out, open up our source folder. I'm also going to edit the scheme so that this opens up in Ableton. So what I could do is I could just change the executable here and then go to applications and then into choosing Ableton, or you could choose any DAW, and I uncheck debug executable. Make sure if you're on Mac that you uncheck that. Okay. So this ensures that we will open up in Ableton to be able to test and debug our plugin as we progress on through. So I've actually created a little text file here just to show some of the classes that we're going to need for the synthesizer. So we're going to need the synthesizer class, okay? So synthesizer is referring to just any sort of bass class that is like a musical instrument that plays notes. Okay, so even though it says synthesizer, this applies to samplers as well. Then we have what's called a sampler sound class. So it might be helpful if I actually show you these as I go through. So we have the synthesizer class. So that's the class for a musical device that could play sounds. So we could do loads of stuff with this, voice stealing, all kinds of stuff. Then we have the sampler sound class, which represents our sampled audio clip. So we'll load up an audio clip, and the synthesizer sound represents that audio clip. And as we can see, sampler sound inherits from synthesizer sound. So sampler sound is a type of synthesizer sound. So then we have sampler voice. And we have sampler voice. Sampler voice are, I think of more like the number of voices that a sampler can play. So, you know, if you have like a Moog synthesizer, it can only play, most of them can only play one voice at a time, as opposed to like a Juno 8, which would be like a polyphonic synth where you could play like 16 voices at once. So the sampler voice class really kind of defines the number of voices that the sampler can play. So that is what we're going to use for building the actual sampler itself. Then we have to think about file loading. So we have to load a file to be able to play it. And for that, we're going to mainly use the file chooser class, which is loading the browser dialog that you saw earlier, where we can actually choose a file to play. And then we have the file class, which is the actual kind of file itself that we choose. Then we have this task of taking the file and converting it into a stream that we can actually play samples from. So for that, we have the audio format manager class, and that kind of registers our basic audio formats so that we're able to do stuff with formats like .mp3, .wav, so on and so forth. And then you have the audio format reader class, which reads the actual samples from the audio stream. So those are the main classes that we will be using today. So I will put that aside and I will minimize this for now. And I forgot to do one key thing. So if we go back into our sampler, our producer itself, key thing that we need to do is go into the settings. So you have the sprocket here, up here at the very top left. And key thing that we want to do is check in plugin is a synth and plugin MIDI input. If you don't have these two checked in, then your plugin will not work properly. Okay, so now we're opening back up in Xcode again, and now we're back. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to create a synthesizer. So we can just do that by creating a synthesizer object, and I will call this mSampler. And that is, I use the M to symbolize any sort of member variables that I have that are for the whole class. So then going into the synthesizer class, so let's just go in here, and I like to show everybody how I find these methods. So one method that we want to use is we want to define how many voices that we want I keep on saying synthesizer, but it's actually a sampler, how many voices we want the sampler to have. So for this one, let's do 3 voices. So what I could do is I can go back to my header, and here I will say const int, and I will call this mnum voices, and I will set this to 3. And then what I could do is I could go back to my constructor in my CPP, and I could say I can make a for loop I is less than mnum voices I plus plus, and then we could say mSampler add voice, and then here we will say we'll create a new sampler voice. Okay, so that creates 3 sampler voices that we can call on within our sampler, and we do that in the constructor. We don't need to add voices at any other point in this project. Okay, so that's fine. Now, next, let's have a look at, let's see here. So let's have a look at file loading really quick. Okay, so we have, let me just pull this up here. So we have the file loading. So we need the file chooser class and the file class. So what I could do is I could create a button here really quick. So, and I'm doing this super hyper quick, right? This is just the very simple example of how to do this. So I will say, I'll create a text button and I'll call this load button. And what we could do is we can put the text of what we want on here. So I'll just call it load. So that's the actual text that's going to show up on the button itself. Then what we could do is I will make this 200 by 200. So that just sets the size of the background itself. And then I will say mload button. And then what I want to do is I want to define what happens when I click the load button. Okay. And here we could use a lambda. So this is just a very small function that I'm going to call that just basically executes when I click on the button. Okay, so it says when I click on the button, execute this function. That's essentially what I'm doing. Okay, so at the moment I don't actually have a function that I've created for this. So let's go back to our processor very quickly, and I'm going to, I think this is going to be fine. I don't think that's going to be an error. So I will create a function called load file, and then let's just put it on down here. And load file. Okay. Now this is where we need to actually use our file chooser class. Okay. So actually I'm going to keep that open for now. And let's go back to the API. And let's go to the file chooser class. Here we go. So here we have a constructor for file chooser. So it has all of these arguments, but as we can see, when it has these equals something in the arguments, that means that they're optional, right? So all of these except for the first one are optional. So we could just make a string that just says, hey, what do you want it to say when your file chooser comes up? So I could just say file chooser, and I'll just call this chooser, and then I'll say, please load a file. Okay. Now we have, so now we want to search for a file, right? We want our dialog box to open up. We want to choose a file. So now we can just use this function called browse for file to open. Okay. And this returns a Boolean, right? So I could say if chooser dot browse for file to open, and then what I could say is now I want to get the result of that file, right? So now we need to go to the file class. Okay, and this is something that I'm kind of zipping through, but you learn this over time. Okay, you learn the API, what sort of classes that you need to call on to do these things. Okay, so going back to our file chooser, I'm just going to open that up in a different window. So file chooser. Okay, so we have this method that's get result, and it returns the last file that was chosen by the browse for methods. Okay, so what I could say is I could say auto file equals chooser get result. Right, so now we get a result, and hopefully it's an audio file. Okay, so now we got the result. Let's go back to our little kind of overview here, and now we have these two classes. We have this audio format manager class, registers basic audio formats, so we're going to need that, and then an audio format reader class. Okay, so I'm going to do a audio format manager, then format manager, and then I'm going to create an audio format reader as a pointer. Okay, and the reason is, and I'm going to set it to null pointer to start off with. And the reason that I'm doing that is because what if I want to choose another file? Well, I don't want to, if I want to choose another file, I don't want to delete the reader itself. I just want it to point somewhere else. Okay, so I don't need to create another reader every time I want to choose a different file. I just want the reader to create. I just want to create a reader for a different file every time that I want to load up a different file to play in my sampler. Okay, so another thing that I could do is I go up to the destructor and then I say I'm going to set this back to null pointer when in my destructor when my plugin gets destroyed or when it gets closed. Okay. So now what I could do is, once again, I have this format managed. I'm sorry, MANAGER. Okay. And one thing that we want to do, if we go back to the audio format manager, and if you're not familiar with what I'm doing here, I actually go into more detail in another tutorial on loading and playing a file. So building a basic audio player, and I will link that to you in the top right of this video. So audio format manager, we have this function that's called register basic formats. And this is a method for registering the formats that come with JUCE. So that's .wave, I believe it does .mp3. And we need to actually call this in the constructor. Okay, so we got format manager, register basic formats. So that just allows us to use .waves, .mp3s, so on and so forth in our program to actually stream audio. Okay, so down here, down at the bottom, we can just say format reader. So remember that's a pointer, an audio format reader pointer. And what I could do is I could say format manager, and then I have this function that's quite handy called create reader for. Okay, so it actually creates a reader for my file. Okay, so let's go through this. So we have a file chooser. It opens up a browser dialog where we can choose a file. Then if we actually choose a file, we want to get the result of that. That's stored in this file. And then what we do is we create a reader for the file. Okay, so that's how we get our actual file to load up in the sampler. Okay, so now if we go back to our synthesizer class, actually I'm going to create another tab here. And we have, let's go down here. So if we go back to our overview here, we see that we have a sampler sound class that represents the sampled audio clip that we want to play, right? So it makes sense that we want to somehow associate the audio clip that we're going to control in the sampler sound class with the file that we want to load, that we want to play different notes of, right? So now we go into sampler sound class, and here we can just say sampler sound, and we can actually declare some parameters here. Okay, so this big integer one was a little bit confusing for me because I wasn't sure what to do, and luckily the community from the Discord actually helped me there, and I will explain that to you shortly. So we have this sampler sound where we can actually put our audio format reader as one of the parameters and give it a name. Okay, then we have our sampler voice. So sampler voice is here, and then where is it? So this method is actually in the synthesizer class where we actually add the sounds. So here is where we do this at. So we have synthesizer sound. So we have add sound here where we can say sampler add sound, And then here is where we want to create a new sampler voice, or sampler sound rather. I always get those confused. And then we need our parameters in here. So I will just copy these for now. Paste them in here. So we have a string name. I will just call this sample. Then we have our audio format reader source. So it takes a reference. So what we need to do is dereference our M format reader, which is currently a pointer. So when it's a pointer and it needs a reference, we need to use the star operator at the start rather, and that will dereference and give us our reference to our format reader. Now this const big integer MIDI notes actually confused me for a moment. There's actually what you have to do. The big integer MIDI notes is actually to give the range of MIDI notes that you want the sound to be able to play across. In this case, we want it to be able to play across the whole range of the keyboard. So what I could do is I could create a big integer called range, and then we got range, and then we have a function called set range. And then I'm not going to get into what a big integer is. It's essentially like a whole set of booleans. So I believe it goes from 0 to 128. And so if I wanted the sound to only be able to play across a certain range, I can actually define that here in between. If I only wanted to play it from, I think, MIDI note 12 to 128, I could do that there. I don't really know, I confess I don't really know a whole lot about this or why this is the way it is, but I actually had some people from the community that helped me out with that. So big shout out to Eyal and Daniel and Traliver. I think his name is Traliver. He helped out as well. And Zanakios from the community, who have always been a big help. So that's why we need range in there. Then we have MIDI note for normal pitch. So that's what MIDI note you would want to play at for the pitch to be normal. So normally that's C3, which is MIDI note 60. And then you can set an attack and release time. So I'm just going to put this to 0.1 and 0.1. So this is just going to play as soon as I press the key down and stop as soon as I release the key. And then we have max sample length seconds. So I will put this to 10 seconds. Okay, so that's what we're doing there. So we're adding, once we've chosen a file, that will add the actual, it will create a new sampler sound that contains our audio for our actual audio file. Okay, so that's how we do that. Now down here, what we could do is in our process block, I could just get rid of all this commentary. Okay, and I can actually get rid of all this as well. So we actually only need one method in here, which is, I think it's called render next block. So the nice thing about this is that it actually parses through the MIDI for us. We don't need to worry about parsing through the MIDI buffer or anything. We can actually just give it our output audio, which is called buffer. We give it the input MIDI, which is MIDI messages. So that's the incoming MIDI messages from our MIDI controller. Then we'll say start sample is from 0. And then number of samples will be buffer, get num samples. Okay, and there's one more thing that we need to do here, which is quite important. If you don't do it, you will get a crash or it won't work properly. So we have to tell our sampler the sample rate. So we need to do this in prepare to play. So prepare to play is whenever our host is stopping, getting ready to play, it will call prepare to play, or if for some reason the buffer size changes or the sample rate changes, then it will call prepare to play. Okay, so we have to say sampler set current playback sample rate, and then we have this helper function get sample. Actually, we don't need that here. We could just say sample rate. Okay, just give it the sample rate. Okay, now let's go back to our editor, and I didn't really finish what I was doing here on the UI side here. So we have the button. When we click on the button, we want it to do something. So we want it to call load file. Remember our load file method that we created earlier. So that's what we want to call when we hit the load button, right? So we could say we have this reference to our processor here. So the processor allows us to access all of our stuff, all of our public information here from our plugin processor. Okay, so that's why we could just say processor and then load file. Okay, make sure you put a semicolon there because it's inside a lambda, and then after the line there. And then what we need to do is make our load button a child component of this component, this background component that we're in currently. So that's why we do that. And now all we need to do is just actually make it visible on the screen. So I could call mload button set bounds, and I'll just do it super simple here. So we have a 200 by 200 background. So what I could do is I could say get width, which gives us the width of our plugin. I'll divide it by 2, which puts us in the middle of the screen. And then I will say -50. And then I will do get height. Same thing, divided by 2, which puts us in the middle of the screen. -50. So that puts us -50 on the y-axis. And then I will just make the width and height 100 and 100. Okay, so that should put our button right in the middle of the screen. Okay, so let's go ahead and build and see what happens here. It looks like I might have an error. Oh, no, it looks like we're good. So here we go. And while this is building, I should have some more merchandise coming soon. So we have some hoodies, t-shirts, we have hats, mugs if you want to drink your coffee and think about audio programming. We have a whole bunch of stuff that's going to be on its way. So should be in by the end of the week, and that will be coming soon. So really cool stuff. So here we are. We're in a new file here. I'm going to go down here, and here is our plugin, Hello Sampler. And there is our box. So now I can click in here. That loads our dialog. And now I click load up a .wav. And now so that plays fine, right? And you can actually play 3 of them at this. You can do 3 voices at the same time. Okay, yeah, that overloads the audio a little bit, but you get the idea. So yeah, so that is like the basic hello world of sampling. And I'm going to do a couple future tutorials that are going to talk about ways that we can actually start to expand on this model. So this is just getting us started on the beginning of our sampler journey. So I hope you enjoyed this. Be sure to give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe and all of that business. And I will see you next time.